One night, everyone in my town had the same dream, a silent, black tower. The next day, life stopped. The shops closed, the streets emptied, because everyone was in the town square. They were building the tower from the dream, stone by stone. They weren't just dreaming anymore. They were obeying. The dream always began with the sensation of falling upward. There was no body, no rushing wind against the skin, only a swift and silent acceleration through a cold, featureless void. The destination was always the same, a single, unmoving point in the center of the nothingness, the Black Tower. It was a structure of impossible geometry, possessing no windows, no doors, no ornamentation of any kind. Its surface was a perfect, seamless obsidian that did not reflect light but consumed it, a hole in the shape of a tower. It did not seem built so much as it seemed to have been left behind, an absolute and incomprehensible fact of this silent, empty universe. For 2 nights, Caleb woke from the dream with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the cold of the void still clinging to him like a shroud. During the day, the town was the same as it had always been, a quiet collection of houses and shops nestled in a river valley. But a subtle strangeness had begun to seep into the mundane. People's eyes were distant, their conversations muted. A shared weariness hung over them, a collective exhaustion that went beyond simple lack of sleep. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if conserving their energy for some great and unspoken task that awaited them in the night. The dream was no longer just a private horror, he felt its echoes in the waking world, a low hum of shared experience just beneath the surface of daily life. He saw the baker staring at a dark loaf of pumpernickel bread with a strange, fixed intensity. He overheard 2 women at the post office speaking in low tones not of gossip, but of the smoothness of certain stones they had seen by the riverbed. It was a quiet, creeping consensus, a town slowly turning its collective gaze inward toward the same shared, nocturnal vision. The dream was a seed, and it had been planted in every mind in town. On the 3rd night of the dream, Caleb woke not with a jolt of terror, but to a sound from the world outside his window. It was a quiet, rhythmic tapping, a steady and methodical beat in the deep silence of the pre-dawn hours. The sound was measured, patient, and utterly out of place. He slipped out of bed, the wooden floor cold beneath his feet, and crept to the window, parting the curtains just enough to see. The moon was high and full, bathing the manicured lawns and quiet street in a pale, ethereal light. And in the yard directly across from his, he saw his neighbor. It was Mr. Abernathy, the old town carpenter, a man who had spent 60 years of his life working with wood. But he was not in his workshop. He was kneeling in the center of his lawn, bathed in the moonlight, a small hammer and chisel in his hands. Before him sat a large, dark stone he must have dragged from the nearby woods. And with a craftsman's unnerving precision, he was tapping away at it, not breaking it, but shaping it. Under the patient, rhythmic blows of his tools, the rough stone was slowly taking the form of a perfect, smooth, rectangular brick of impossible, light-swallowing blackness. Caleb stared, his breath caught in his throat. The brick was not just a brick. It was a piece of the tower. He recognized its flawless surface, its non-reflective darkness. Mr. Abernathy was not just a carpenter having a strange, sleepless night. He was a builder. He was creating a single, perfect component of the impossible structure from their shared dream. The rhythmic tapping was not just a sound, it was the first note of a terrible symphony. The nightmare was no longer contained by sleep. It had found a foothold in the waking world, and it was beginning to build itself, one perfect, black brick at a time. Within a week, the rhythmic tapping of Mr. Abernathy's chisel was no longer a solitary sound. It had become a chorus, a low, percussive hum that seemed to emanate from every backyard and garage in the small town. The dream of the Black Tower was no longer a secret, nocturnal visitor. It had become the sole, obsessive focus of the waking world. The pretense of normal life, which had been fraying at the edges, finally tore apart completely. One Monday morning, the town simply stopped performing the motions of its former existence. The slow, creeping consensus had become an open, unified, and silent declaration. The bakery did not open its doors, the warm, familiar smell of fresh bread absent from the morning air for the first time in 50 years. The school bus, with its cheerful yellow paint, did not make its usual rumbling journey down the quiet residential streets. The doors of the town hall remained locked, the flag hanging limp and forgotten on its pole. The quiet, predictable rhythms of small-town life, which had governed this place for generations, had ceased to exist. The town had collectively resigned from its own reality, answering a new and more urgent calling. One by one, then in small groups, then in a great, silent procession, the people emerged from their homes. They were not dressed for work or for school. They wore simple, functional clothes, their faces devoid of any expression save for a deep, hollow-eyed weariness. But their hands were not empty. Their movements were not aimless. They were driven by a single, shared, and unspoken purpose, a directive that had been downloaded into every mind during the silent, upward fall of the nightly dream. They moved toward the center of town, toward the manicured green of the town square. They brought with them stones. Dark stones, black stones, stones the color of a starless midnight sky. They carried them with a slow, deliberate reverence, as if they were holy relics. Some were small, smooth river rocks, gleaned from the bed of the creek that ran along the edge of town. Others were larger, rougher chunks of basalt and shale, dug up from the foundations of their own homes, their hands raw and bleeding from the effort. They were dismantling their own world, piece by piece, to provide the raw materials for a new one. Their shared obsession was a form of architectural cannibalism. They began to lay the stones in the center of the square, directly on top of the manicured lawn that had hosted 1,000 summer picnics and town festivals. There was no foreman shouting orders, no architect consulting a set of blueprints. There was only a collective, instinctual knowledge, a shared, three-dimensional map of the tower that existed in every one of their minds. Each person seemed to know exactly where their stone was meant to go, fitting it into place with a quiet, unnerving precision, their movements perfectly synchronized, a silent ballet of communal construction. The foundation grew with a slow, organic certainty, a dark, spreading stain on the green heart of the town. The sounds of their work were muted, rhythmic, and constant. The scrape of stone on stone, the soft thud of a rock being settled into place, the quiet, collective breathing of 100 people working as a single organism. There were no conversations, no wasted motions. They were a human anthill, their individual wills completely subsumed by the singular, overwhelming instinct to build the nest, to raise the spire, to give physical form to the nightmare that had become their only god. Caleb watched from the window of his second-story apartment, a lone, terrified observer of this silent, unfolding madness. He had not joined them. The dream still came to him every night, a silent, screaming vortex of upward motion. But unlike the others, he woke from it with a feeling of profound, primal dread. For him, the tower was not a holy calling, it was a tombstone. He watched the faces of people he had known his entire life, the town librarian, the high school football coach, the cheerful checkout girl from the grocery store, and saw only strangers, their eyes as vacant and dark as the stones they carried. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the collective consciousness. While the rest of the town had surrendered to the dream, he was fighting it, clinging to the rapidly dissolving memory of the world as it had been. But he was one man against a tide of silent, shared obsession. The tower was growing, a squat, dark cylinder that was already taller than a man. It was an alien object, a piece of the cold, empty dream void made manifest in the warm, living world. And with every stone that was added to its height, he felt the world he had known slipping further and further away, replaced by the cold, hard, and terrifying logic of the tower. Caleb tried to resist. He barricaded himself in his apartment, a fortress of one against the silent, creeping tide of the town's shared madness. He drew the curtains, plunging his rooms into a perpetual twilight, a futile attempt to block out the sight of the ever-growing structure in the square. He stuffed cotton in his ears, then wore industrial-grade earmuffs he found in the abandoned hardware store. But the sound, the low, monotonous, and unending rhythm of stone being shaped and placed, was not just an auditory phenomenon. It was a vibration that traveled through the very ground, up the foundations of his building, a constant, percussive pulse that he felt in his bones, in his teeth, in his skull. He tried to distract himself, to anchor his mind to the world that was, to the reality that he remembered. He pulled his old books from their shelves, the words a lifeline to a time of logic and reason. But the steady, relentless beat from outside made concentration impossible. The words on the page would blur, the sentences losing their meaning, the steady, rhythmic tapping a brutal, hypnotic metronome that drowned out all other thought. The tower was not just being built in the town square, it was being built inside his own head, a dark, silent structure that was slowly, methodically, and relentlessly displacing his own sanity. He saw the people he had known his entire life transform into silent, obsessed builders. The town doctor, a man known for his gentle bedside manner and his love of bad jokes, now worked with a grim, focused intensity, his soft hands raw and bloodied from heaving heavy stones. The young couple who had just moved in next door, whose laughter had once filled the summer evenings, now worked side by side in a silent, synchronized trance, their faces blank, their movements as precise and unthinking as the gears in a clock. They had ceased to be individuals, they were now merely components, organic machinery in the service of a single, monolithic purpose. They worked without rest, without food, without sleep. The concept of day and night had become meaningless. They toiled under the pale, indifferent sun and continued their work under the harsh, artificial glare of portable construction lights they had taken from the abandoned public works department. Their movements were a marvel of horrific, synchronized efficiency, like a colony of ants building their mound. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. Each builder knew their place, their role, their next movement in the grand, silent, and terrible choreography of the construction. The tower grew, an ugly, alien spire of black stone that clawed its way into the perpetually gray and overcast sky. It was a violation of the town's quaint, small-town aesthetic, a brutalist monument to a shared nightmare. It distorted the familiar, gentle line of the horizon, a stark, black needle aimed at the heart of the sky. It seemed to suck the very color from the air around it, its dark, light-swallowing surface making the already drab world seem even more washed out, more lifeless. It was the physical manifestation of the town's encroaching insanity. The town was no longer a town. It was a labor camp. It was a cult, its entire population enthralled to the silent, terrible god of the tower. The air was thick with the dust of worked stone and the unspoken, oppressive weight of a single, monolithic idea. Caleb, in his self-imposed prison, was the last heretic, the final, dissenting voice in a world that had become a single, unified, and terrifyingly silent choir. The isolation was a new kind of hell, a solitude made all the more profound by the constant, rhythmic presence of the hundreds of people just outside his window. He could not bear it any longer. To stay was to eventually succumb. He could feel the dream's logic, the tower's brutal, simple purpose, beginning to seep through the cracks in his own resistance. He would find himself staring at a dark stone in his fireplace, his hands itching with the phantom memory of a hammer and chisel. The choice was no longer between staying and leaving. It was between surrender and escape. And so, with the last vestiges of his own, individual will, with the final, flickering embers of his fear, he made his decision. He would run. The defeat was absolute. Caleb stumbled back from the edge of reality, his heart a wild, panicked bird in the cage of his ribs. The white wall of fog did not recede, did not shimmer, did not give any indication that it was a temporary or natural phenomenon. It was a statement of fact, a final, unyielding boundary. He was not a citizen of a country, or a planet. He was an inmate in a town, a single, isolated terrarium floating in an ocean of absolute, featureless nothing. The hope of escape, which had been the single, flickering candle in the darkness of his mind, was now extinguished, leaving him in a blackness more profound than he had ever imagined. He turned his back on the white abyss and faced the town. The rhythmic, monotonous hammering, which had been the sound of his prison, now sounded, somehow, like the only real thing in the universe. It was the pulse of his world, the only proof that anything beyond his own consciousness still existed. The walk back was a death march of hope, each step a confirmation of his own damnation. He no longer saw the familiar houses and streets of his childhood. He saw the intricate, detailed scenery of a cage, a meticulously crafted illusion designed to give the impression of a world that did not exist. The town no longer felt like a place that had gone mad. It felt like a place that had been created mad, its sole purpose now hideously and unavoidably clear. He re-entered the town's invisible border, and no one looked up, no one acknowledged his return. He was a ghost, a loose cog in a machine that had no need for him, his brief rebellion a meaningless, unobserved flicker. He walked through the streets, now seeing the builders not as his former neighbors, but as the mindless, biological machinery of the place itself, their purpose as integral to the town's existence as the rising of the sun had once been. He returned to his apartment, the door unlocked and waiting, as if it had known he would be back. The small, familiar space was no longer a sanctuary. It was his designated cell. The books on his shelves, the photographs on his walls, the worn armchair by the window, they were all just props, set dressing for the single, conscious character in this elaborate, solitary play. He ran his hand over a dusty photograph of himself as a child, smiling on a beach he now knew had never existed outside of this contained reality. He was a man with a fabricated past, living in a manufactured present, with no hope of a future. For days, he did nothing but watch. His resistance was gone, burned away by the cold, white fire at the edge of the world. It was replaced by a morbid, fatalistic curiosity. He sat at his window and simply observed the great and terrible work unfolding in the town square. The tower was nearing completion now. It was a structure of impossible scale, a single, black, monolithic spire that seemed to tear a hole in the perpetually gray sky. Its upper reaches were permanently lost in the thick, low-hanging clouds, giving the impression that it might go on forever, a needle stitching the sky to the earth. The tower exerted a palpable influence on its surroundings. The air at its base was unnaturally cold, a pocket of deep, dreamlike winter in the otherwise mild climate. It seemed to swallow sound. The constant hammering of the builders was strangely muffled near its surface, as if the black stone itself were absorbing the vibrations. It was a monument to silence and to an alien, non-human geometry. It did not belong in a world of gentle hills and winding rivers. It belonged in the cold, empty void of the dream from which it had been born. The builders themselves were changing. They had grown gaunt, skeletal, their skin stretched tight over their bones, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. They were no longer running on food or on rest, they were fueled by the dream itself, by the single, burning, and all-consuming imperative to complete their task. Their movements had become even more precise, more synchronized, utterly devoid of any last, lingering trace of human individuality. They were a single, unified organism of flesh and bone, a human machine building a stone god. A sense of impending climax, of a great and terrible finality, began to hang in the air. The rhythm of the work grew faster, more frantic, more urgent. The builders moved with a feverish intensity, their hammers rising and falling in a blur of motion. The tower was not just being built, it was being willed into existence, a physical manifestation of a collective, suicidal desire. Caleb, watching from his window, felt the change in the rhythm in his own bones. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the final, terrible note of its own symphony. He could not watch from a distance any longer. The tower was no longer just an object of his terror, it was the answer to the question of his own existence. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that he would not survive its completion. But he had to understand it. He had to know the nature of his own tomb. Driven by this final, morbid need, he left his apartment and began to walk toward the town square. He walked through the ranks of the builders, a ghost of a man moving through an army of wraiths, and none of them so much as flickered an eye in his direction. He stood at the base of the tower. Up close, its scale was crushing, divine. The sheer, seamless black wall rose up before him into the gray nothingness of the sky, its presence so absolute that it seemed to bend the world around it. The cold radiating from its surface was a physical thing, a force that pushed against him, a cold that felt ancient and full of a vast, cosmic sorrow. He looked at the perfectly fitted stones, each one a testament to a single, shared, and terrible purpose. He felt an inexplicable, insane urge to become a part of it, to lay his hands upon it, to connect with the great and terrible truth it represented. He reached out a trembling hand. This was not an act of defiance. It was an act of surrender. It was the final, desperate plea of a conscious mind seeking to understand the nature of its own annihilation. He pressed his palm flat against the impossibly smooth, impossibly cold surface of a single, black stone. For a moment, there was nothing but the physical sensation of the cold, dead rock against his warm, living flesh. And then, his consciousness exploded. It was not a sound, not a light, not a thought. It was a sudden and total dissolution of the self. The walls of his own mind dissolved, and he was flooded with the collective consciousness of the entire town. He felt their shared dream, their unified purpose, their singular, burning desire. It was not madness. It was a desperate, instinctual drive, the final, unified act of 1,000 dying cells. He understood that they were not building a monument to a god. They were building a weapon. He felt their shared, unspoken knowledge, build, ascend, pierce. They were not worshipping a nightmare, they were trying to kill it. And then, he felt the dreamer. It was a consciousness so vast, so ancient, so utterly alien that his own mind buckled under the sheer scale of it. He was a single, fleeting thought in a mind the size of a galaxy. And the mind was in agony. It was a great, cosmic being, a sleeping god, and its dream was a terminal illness. The town, the people, the gray sky, Caleb himself, they were all just fragments of a fever dream, the dying thoughts of a dying god. The world was a cancer, and the cancer was aware of its own malignancy. He understood everything. The tower was not a spire. It was a needle. A great, black, surgical instrument, built by the dream's own inhabitants, by the god's own dying thoughts, for a single, terrible purpose. It was an act of cosmic euthanasia. A mercy killing. The builders were not insane, they were surgeons, working with a desperate, unified purpose to plunge the needle into the heart of the dreamer, to wake the god, even if it meant their own instantaneous and absolute annihilation. To end the dream was to end the dreamer's suffering. And to end the dream was to end their own existence. He pulled his hand back from the stone, the terrible, burning weight of this new knowledge settling into the core of his being. The cold of the stone was now inside him. He was no longer Caleb, the last sane man in a mad world. He was now just another cell in a dying body, a single, aware thought in a mind that was desperately, methodically, and relentlessly preparing to commit suicide. He looked at the faces of the builders, and for the first time, he saw not madness, but a profound and terrible love. He was one of them now. And all he could do was wait for the needle to be placed, for the final, merciful blow to fall. The final stone ascended. It rose through the cold, gray air, not lifted by a crane or by ropes, but levitated by the sheer, focused, and unified will of the hundreds of builders below. Caleb watched, no longer an outsider, but a part of the collective consciousness, his own small sliver of will added to the great, silent, upward force. The last, perfect, black capstone, shaped like the point of a spear, floated upward, past the highest reaches of the town's familiar buildings, past the tops of the tallest imaginary trees, and disappeared into the thick, low-hanging clouds that had always served as the ceiling of their world. For a moment, the rhythmic, monotonous hammering continued, a mindless, reflexive echo of a task that was now complete. And then, in a single, perfectly synchronized instant, every hammer was lowered. Every chisel was set down. The constant, percussive pulse that had been the heartbeat of the town for weeks, for months, for what felt like an eternity, simply stopped. The absolute, profound, and deafening silence that followed was not an emptiness. It was a held breath. It was the silence of a final, terrible, and sacred purpose fulfilled. The work was done. The needle was in place. Every single builder, as one, stopped their work and tilted their heads back, their gaunt, hollow-eyed faces turned upward toward the invisible peak of the tower, now lost in the gray clouds. They were not looking at their creation with pride. They were not admiring their handiwork. They were listening. They were waiting. Caleb, too, lifted his head, his own will subsumed by the great, collective act of anticipation. He felt a low, deep, and ancient hum begin to build, not in the air, but in the very ground beneath his feet, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the base of the tower itself. The hum grew in intensity, a deep, resonant, and mournful note that made the very stones of the town square vibrate. It was a sound that was both a sigh of immense, cosmic weariness and the first, stirring rumble of an awakening. It was the sound of a sleeping god beginning to stir in its long, terminal nightmare. The tower was working. The great, black needle, plunged into the heart of the dream, was sending a shockwave through the dreamer's consciousness. Caleb felt the vibration not just in his feet, but in his very atoms, a feeling of being a part of something vast, terrible, and holy. He lowered his gaze from the sky and looked toward the edge of town, toward the place where he had once tried to escape. He looked toward the impassable, white wall of fog that had defined the limits of his world. And he saw it begin to change. The static, featureless white began to shimmer, to lose its solidity. The wall, which had been an absolute and eternal boundary, began to waver, to thin, to dissolve. It was not a gentle mist burning off in the morning sun. It was a curtain of reality being deliberately, methodically, and finally pulled back. The white fog did not reveal the familiar, comforting sight of a pine forest, of a county road, of a world beyond the town. As the mist receded, it revealed only a profound, absolute, and starless darkness. It was not the simple blackness of a moonless night. It was the deep, ontological black of a true and perfect void, the empty space between realities. The town had not been an island on an earth that had gone mad. It had been a single, isolated thought, a floating, self-contained dream, in the vast, empty, and unconscious mind of a sleeping entity. And in the center of that void, in the place where a sun or a moon should have been, something began to open. It was a slow, majestic, and terrifying process, like the birth of a galaxy, or the dawning of a terrible, new sun. A single, curved line of impossibly bright light appeared in the darkness, and then another, slowly parting to reveal a vast, cosmic, and utterly non-human eye. The iris was a swirling nebula of colors he had never seen, and the pupil was a blackness so deep and so absolute it made the tower itself seem pale and gray. The god was waking up. The dream was ending. The eye, the size of a mountain range, blinked once, a slow, geological movement that sent a ripple of force through the dissipating dream world. Caleb looked at the faces of the builders around him. Their expressions were no longer blank, no longer vacant. They were filled with a profound, serene, and terrible ecstasy, the expressions of martyrs witnessing the face of their God in the final moment of their own annihilation. They had succeeded. They had delivered their dying God from its own terrible dream. He looked down at his own hands. They were no longer solid. The edges were blurring, losing their definition, the skin and bone beginning to dissolve into a fine, gray, and shimmering dust. He felt no pain, no fear, only a sense of profound, cosmic rightness. He was a thought, and the thinker was now awake. He was a fragment of a dream, and the dream was now over. He watched as his own body, and the bodies of everyone around him, and the stones of the tower, and the very ground beneath his feet, unmade themselves, their substance returning to the pure, undifferentiated consciousness of the newly awakened God. A wind that had never existed before began to blow through the dissolving town, a gentle, cosmic breeze that carried the gray ash of the dying dream away into the vast, starless night. The last thing Caleb saw, before his own eyes dissolved into nothingness, was the great, cosmic eye of the dreamer, no longer filled with the agony of a terminal nightmare, but with a look of profound, silent, and eternal peace. The last thought of the dream was one of gratitude. And then, there was nothing at all.